Good morning everyone. How are you all? Students, in today's video lecture, we are going to study the second chapter of Snapshot book. The name of the chapter is The Address and it has been written by Marga Menko. Students, about the author. Marga Menko actually is the pseudonym of Sarah Menko and she was born on 31st of March 1920. She is a Dutch journalist and writer. Her surname was Menko, and she was born in an Orthodox Jewish family. Student, she published her first book in 1957 by the name of Bitter Herb only. Now, students, say the story of the chapter has four prominent characters, and they are Marga Menko, who is the narrator, Mrs. S, the mother of the narrator, Mrs. Dorling, who is an acquaintance of the narrator's mother, and a girl of 15. She is the daughter of Mrs. Dorling. Student, this chapter is divided into three parts. First part is when Marga Menko visited first time to Mrs. Dorling house. Second is this when the story goes in flashback. And the last part is, student, when Marga Menko's second visit is there to Mrs. Dorling house only. So let us begin the story, students. The story is that this is a moving story actually, student, of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. And the narrator is the actually the daughter of Mrs. S, who died during the war. The narrator went to number 46 Marconi Street to see Mrs. Dorling, who was an old acquaintance of her mother and who had taken almost all the belongings of her mother during the war to this place. So all this was done with Mrs. S. silent consent only, as Mrs. Dorling wanted to save her things which they would have lost if they had to leave the place. So the narrator had seen Mrs. Dorling for the first time during the first half of the war. She used to come for a few days and she noticed the change in the rooms. She missed various things. Her mother informed her that Mrs. Dorling had moved these things to safety and gave her the address 46 Marconi Street. And student, do you know what happened after the war? The narrator visited this place. Right? The narrator visited the this address which her mother gave to her. So she remembered Mrs. Dorling clearly. She was a woman with a broad back. Mrs. Dorling looked at the narrator searchingly, and she showed no sign of recognition. She kept staring in silence, right? So she saw that the narrator, who had recognized her mother's green knitted cardigan, was looking at it. So what she did? She half hid herself behind the door and she refused to see her, to meet her, and even to talk to her. She was surprised actually to see the narrator who had survived from the war. So the narrator, you know, saw all these things and she was refused by Mrs. Dorling. So the narrator returned to the station and she boarded the train also. And while in the train, she remembered the first time she had seen Mrs. Dorling and how her mother introduced her to her old acquaintance and given the address. She remembered everything clearly. And after the first fruitless visit, now this was the first useless visit to Mrs. Darling's house. After the first fruitless visit to Mrs. Darling's house, students, the narrator visited this place a second time. And do you know what happened? This time, a girl of about 15 opened the door to her and she asked her if her mother was at home. Since she was away, Mrs. Darling was not at home, so the narrator decided to wait for her. The daughter of Mrs. Darling invited her to her home, so she followed the girl along the passage. The first thing that struck her was an old fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. Then they went into the living room. The narrator was horrified as she was in a room she knew and she did not know also. On one hand, she knew everything. On the other hand, this place was alien to her. So she found herself in the midst of things she had so wanted to see again, but which oppressed her in the strange atmosphere. So the tasteless way of arrangement, ugly furniture, and the muggy smell all contributed to arouse this feeling. So she did not have courage to look around actually. So she sat down and what happened is stared at the wooden tablecloth. So student, as she followed the lines of pattern, she remembered that it was their tablecloth which had a burn mark that had never been repaired. So she found the hole also in the tablecloth. Now, student, the girl poured her tea from a white pot which had a gold border on the lid. She opened the box, took out some spoons. The narrator praised the box. Mrs. Darling's daughter said that it was an antique. They had got lots more, and she pointed round the room. The narrator knew very well which things she meant, so she remembered that the cutlery, spoons, fork, and knives was of silver, everything. So the girl laughed. She walked to the sideboard and she wanted to open a drawer. The narrator now started feeling perturbed. She was not feeling good. Started feeling uneasy there. The objects linked with her mother aroused memories of her former life. Now, students. At first, she was eager to see them, wanted to see everything, but now they had lost their values since they were separated from her mother. And now, student, all those things were stored in strange surroundings. So, moreover, student, they were useless now to her because it was useless to her in her present state because she lived in a small rented room with a space for more than a handful of cutlery fitted in the narrow table drawer only. So, student, she resolved to forget the address. She wanted now to forget this address, Marconi Street, and she wanted to leave the memories of her mother and the war behind her, and then she decided to move on. Thank you, student.